In the last video, I talked about the widening gulf in American society and politics, and I mentioned that the next video, this one, would discuss ideas on how to save our democracy. So that's the discussion right now. I want to repeat, none of these, I mentioned this in the last video, these are not my ideas, and there's nothing particularly novel about my thoughts here. These are ideas that have been discussed by many people over the years, in many instances over many, many years. And they are good ideas. There are pros and cons, but they're worth thinking about. And if we share the belief that our system is not working very well, we ought to look for ways to solve the problems and save our country. There are more independent voters than Democrats in America, and more independent voters than there are Republicans in America. Polling shows that 43% or registration data shows that 43% of US voters are independents. The other 57% are divided approximately equally between the two parties, Democrats and Republicans. This means our candidates, notably for president, are being chosen by a minority of the voters, Democrats by Democrats and Republicans by Republicans. That means that the largest group of voters, independents, are really not being represented, at least not very well in this country. And the reason for this is that we choose our candidates through primaries where you have to be a party affiliate to vote in that primary. So Democrats pick Democrats, Republicans pick Republicans, and the parties cater to the extremes of their parties to get nominated. So we end up with more extreme viewpoints, and centrists are left to choose between two extremes and pick which they think is, in recent times, the lesser of evils. And that, in great part, explains the reason for the wild swings back and forth between far right and far left that are increasing, that I discussed in the last video. So one of the fixes is to open primaries to all voters. And that way, we may end up with different candidates that have more centrist views that appeal to the majority of voters in the United States. It's going to frustrate people on the far left and the far right, but it's going to be more in line with the attitudes and philosophies and desires of most voters. The next idea, and this one is a huge one, and it's a difficult one because of the state of the law, and that is campaign finance reform. In 2010, the United States Supreme Court decided a case called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, and ruled that the First Amendment right of free speech protects corporations as well as individuals, including the right to spend as they wish on political campaigns, essentially without limitation. This wrongly, in my estimation, and I think in the estimation of many scholars, elevates non-communicative conduct to the level of protected speech in the United States. That just seems patently absurd, patently wrong. If money, unlimited spending of money, can be considered communicative, can be considered free expression and free speech, then by logical extension, so should hitting somebody in the mouth. Because what better way to express or communicate displeasure with someone than to smack them? But of course, that's absurd. That's not speech, that's conduct, and it's wrong, it's illegal. The example is extreme, but it illustrates the point. There is a difference between conduct and speech, and spending money is conduct, not speech. So what happened as a result of the Citizens United case is that PACs, political action committees, proliferated, and the spending through PACs increased exponentially, including to influence appointments to the United States Supreme Court through vetting by conservatives and, more importantly, ultra wealthy contributors, multi-billionaires, through groups like the Federalist Society and private foundations, private corporations, and others. And there's a senator, Sheldon Whitehouse, who's been sounding the alarm in Congress on this for many years. And he wrote a book. It's not an exciting book to read, but it is very informative, called The Scheme: How the Right Wing Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court. And he explains how this was done to dismantle regulatory agencies, which we're seeing right now, to undo bank regulations and other laws for consumer protection, including eroding the Environmental Protection Agency, to the detriment of society as a whole. And just the other day, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, in a dissent in an environmental case, wrote that the majority creates the impression that it is acting to protect, and I quote, money interests. And she wrote that the court's ruling may have, and I quote, a reputational cost for this court, which is already viewed by many as being overly sympathetic to corporate interests. She's merely echoing a sentiment that has been expressed for years by Democrats and others, and it's valid. So another fix that I believe in is order, and I think it's extremely important, is to undo the Citizens United case and impose campaign finance reform. The next thing, since I mentioned the Supreme Court, is to have enforceable rules of ethics for the Supreme Court, including removing justices who have an interest or whose spouse or close family members have an interest in the outcome of a particular case, including by a spouse or family member acting on behalf of or representing a particular agency or industry that is being subject to a ruling that is before the court, a case that is before the court. It's really anomalous that every court in the country, all state courts, all federal courts, are subject to ethical rules for the justices or judges, except for the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, to overcome this objection, recently promulgated ethical rules, but they're not binding. And they act as they wish. And there are justices who have, in fact, in recent years, voted repeatedly on cases before them in which they or a family member has a particular interest. And that's plain wrong. It wouldn't be permitted in other federal courts or in our state courts. The next fix, the next proposal to try to repair our democracy is term limits. And this gets bandied about. This has gone on for years and years, about the pros and cons. One of the objections to term limits is if you have term limits, you just as somebody is becoming experienced and starting to understand the system and how best to operate and gaining wisdom, they have to be removed. But look, we have term limits on the president. Why shouldn't we have term limits on senators and congressional representatives? One of the drawbacks of the lack of term limits is that incumbents get reelected out of name recognition often. It's very hard to unseat an incumbent. And a lot of it, it's just because of name recognition. And it's also, there's the old adage about sometimes it's better to dance with the devil you know than to dance with the devil you don't. And so we really need to think twice about having people who are more interested in being reelected than in doing what's right, in having people who become career politicians because it's the best way they see to earn a living. They're not really capable of doing so in the private sector. And to have people who have practical experience instead of just people who want to go into politics and stay in politics and don't really understand the way the private sector works and the way people really operate. So personally, I advocate term limits. I want to make this point too. In the 19th century, when we went through the Industrial Revolution, we experienced all kinds of abuses. Dangerous work environments, including toxic exposure and hazardous equipment, child labor, where children, very young children, worked horribly long hours, hours longer than we allow adults to work today. Price fixing, collusion, and other practices to rig the market against consumers and society as a whole. And many of these abuses were remedied in whole or in part through the enactment of labor laws and antitrust laws. And here we are now, and I would point out that an ultra-wealthy generation became, not generation, but few became even wealthier. The uber wealthy and the who were behind the Industrial Revolution and finance, it became wealthy beyond belief. And here we are going through a similar occurrence as I've talked about. In the last video, I talked about how the concentration of wealth in the top 1% has increased. Well, just like with the Industrial Revolution, we have gone through changes in the current technological revolution where abuses have occurred, and we need to come up with a way to rein those in. And I would mention, as an example, in the 90s, Microsoft was sued by the federal government for antitrust violation because it was, at the time, imposing its Internet Explorer software as the default browser, so that people were really by default forced to accept that. They weren't necessarily forced, but it was made so difficult, so inconvenient for people to go to a different browser that by default they accepted the Internet Explorer browser by Microsoft. And there was a lawsuit, and ultimately it was settled after a change of administrations. The government frankly kowtowed. Microsoft faced possibly being broken up. As a result of the settlement, in my estimation, and I don't pretend to be an expert in this area, but in my estimation, it opened the door for more anti-competitive and anti-market welfare business practices. And we've seen it with Google, and we've seen it with others. The solution is to be more aggressive with marketplace regulation. And so one of the things that I point out, I talked in the last video about young people seeing the world in a binary view, this or that. Capitalism can be good, but unregulated capitalism with no controls whatsoever is definitely going to result with abuses like in the Industrial Revolution, and to a great degree now with the technology revolution. But if we have regulation to control businesses, to protect the marketplace, to protect the workers, to protect the environment, it serves us. How much regulation? What is the right regulation? That's always difficult. But life is difficult, and we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of our democracy entirely because we're going through a difficult period. So that gets to this idea of regulation, and what we need to do is restore, not undermine, the regulatory powers of our federal agencies and state agencies. Our environmental protections, vehicle safety, like seat belts, airbags, all these things were the result of active consumer groups and then consumer protection agencies and the federal government to watch out for us all. Protections in the banking industry, protections in insurance, and other areas owed to consumer activism. We should support this, not discourage it. The current attempts to dismantle our regulatory agencies, I think, are horrendous, and we need to strengthen, not weaken them. But we also have to recognize the potential for overregulation to undermine business, prevent opportunity and development and economic advancement for all of us. Again, it's gray. It's not easy. These are difficult challenges. As they say, the devil is in the details, but as I said before, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Democracy is fraught with problems. As I said, it's often slow to respond, and we need to recognize that, but we need to work within it. We need to understand the regulatory process, and we need to understand that it's difficult. And one of the other things we need to do on the issue of the regulatory process, in my estimation, is impose time limits on how soon somebody leaving a regulatory agency can go into the private sector and work in the same industry because of their relationships with the regulatory agencies and gain benefits that they otherwise would not be able to. So in my estimation, if you're in a regulatory agency, it ought to be a minimum of 5 years before you can go into work as in the private sector and lobby that same agency you work for to get relief for your business. If you agree with me that democracy is worth saving, and with Winston Churchill, that democracy is better than the alternatives, then we should all work to save our democracy and make it better, not get rid of it.